Hello everyone, Thersites the Historian here. I would like to take a look at Rachel Maddow's Drift and analyze the claims that it made historically. Obviously, Maddow is a somewhat controversial author due to some of her political activities, especially over the last several years. I'm not going to get into that too much, but if you want to see me talk about Maddow's descent into madness, then I highly recommend that you look at my Spirit of Thersites channel, as I will be covering that topic in just a couple of days, and also looking at some of the other parts of this book that I won't be talking about here, such as Maddow's policy recommendations at the end, and some speculation on how the book has aged relative to the politics of today, which is 8 years after the book's initial publication. Let's begin by looking at Maddow's central thesis in this book. America is currently enduring endless wars, and it is not because of the 9/11 attacks, but rather because of decades of pro-war voices making deliberate choices to get us to that point. There are a number of major factors which have led us to a state of perpetual mobilization and engagement. This has led in part to a complete and total disconnect between the civilian population and military personnel, hence the name of the title, and also this disconnect between the experiences of military personnel and civilians is what Maddow would talk about during her various interviews trying to advertise the book. Her central focus is on the Abrams Doctrine. She claims that this doctrine was effectively put in place to make it more difficult for the powers that be in the White House to deploy the military, and because it would be such a massive pain in the ass and such a social disruption to call up the National Guard and Reserves to make war, this would hopefully make politicians think twice about why they wanted to deploy the military in the first place. There is some potential problem with how she interprets the Abrams Doctrine. We'll get into that. But fundamentally, I think the idea that having to call up the guards and reserves should make politicians think twice about whether they should go to war or not is a good point, especially if it is a norm that the guards and reserve are only called up when it is absolutely necessary. Maddow also points out many other ways in which the military has been transformed to be a perpetual fighting force. She talks a lot about the rise of contractors and the policy known as log cap, which really got underway in the 90s. So this was effectively her explanation, and the best illustration of where we're at is one that she draws from the Obama years right before the book's publication. In 2011, of course, U.S. Special Forces entered into Pakistan, took bin Laden and executed him without informing the Pakistani government, and the CIA also had an operation station at a hunting ground which was primarily used by Arab emirs. So, Maddow is pointing out the sort of point that we're at now and then researching back as to how we got there. Her book, I think, is an important contribution to that discussion, one that is not had nearly often enough. However, there are some flaws. What I want to do is to look at the things that she gets right and some of the things that maybe she didn't do as well as she could have on. So, first of all, the Abrams Doctrine. It would appear that there is no documented evidence that Creighton Abrams ever intended to make it more difficult to deploy the military as a way to serve as a check on executive power. He never wrote this anywhere, and if this indeed was the effect that the Abrams Doctrine had, this was probably just an unintended consequence, one that most people probably wouldn't complain about too much, since we do need to think long and hard before deploying the military, but not really one that a military man would be likely to make. For the most part, the military tries to be as combat ready as it possibly can, and making it harder to mobilize is just not a conscious decision that a soldier would be likely to make. One site I read, which was talking about the reasons behind the Abrams Doctrine, says that what happened is that when Creighton Abrams was the head of the Joint Chiefs and implemented this doctrine, is effectively he was dealing with constraints in a post-Vietnam world where they were facing budget cuts, and he was trying to create the most combat readiness he could under those conditions. So what he did was shift units that provided support for large deployments to the reserves and the guard. In the event of a crisis, the people you really need on the ready are the combat units. And as things ramp up, you can then call up your reserves and guard, and they can then provide support. It makes sense. So I think that interpretation is probably the correct one if we're trying to get at what Abrams was trying to accomplish. That being said, what was the actual effect of the Abrams Doctrine? Does it have the deterrent effect that Maddow claims? I'm not sure. I think that she might be exaggerating its impact. That being said, the public was weary about calling up all the guards and reserves going into the first Gulf War, at least according to Maddow. That could have also just been general war anxiety. People were still worried about a large-scale war after what had happened in Vietnam, where we got dragged into a quagmire for the better part of a decade and lost about 60,000 Americans. So, from the outset, there are some flaws. One is that I'm not a big fan of how she chose to contextualize the beginning of her story. If I were to write a book on this topic, I think I would begin in Korea, where Truman was able to deploy the U.S. in accordance with a UN resolution, but without going through Congress to get anything like a declaration of war. This was a police action, and because he did not have to go through Congress to do much related to the war, this established a precedent for presidents to effectively do whatever they wanted and not really have to deal that much with Congress. So that, I think, is an important starting point. Maddow doesn't really talk about that. Another place where I would begin if I were writing a book of this nature is by discussing the Presidential War Powers Act and how that was interpreted, especially by Lyndon Johnson. However, while Maddow does talk about Vietnam and mentions LBJ and Nixon, she doesn't really go into detail about how we got so deeply involved in Vietnam. She focuses instead on the origins of the Abrams Doctrine and how it effectively got started, according to her, because Johnson, for political reasons, did not call up the guards and reserves because he thought that they were important constituents, and this would alienate voters if he were to call up people who were supposed to be held in reserve for a major confrontation with the Soviet Union. So what that created was a bizarre situation where if you joined the military as part of the National Guard or the reserves, you were extremely unlikely to be deployed to Vietnam. But you could, if you chose not to sign up anywhere, be drafted and then sent to Vietnam, where you might die. So it was a really weird time, and clearly some reform was needed when it came to how we use the Guard. It doesn't make sense to be part of the military and be immune from deployment, whereas some people who are civilians could find themselves just a few weeks later being in a combat zone. It's kind of bizarre. And of course, it also created a loophole that people like George W. Bush were able to exploit. His service in the Air National Guard meant that he was effectively immune from Vietnam. So, I'm fairly skeptical about her claims about the effect of the Abrams Doctrine. What I believe is that the effect was to try to allay concerns that people had about the draft. Most of the anti-Vietnam demonstrations were about the draft. There were plenty about human rights abuses and things of that nature and U.S. imperialism, but at the heart of it for many people was the fear that they personally might be drafted and sent to die in a foreign land for no reason. So, without really understanding that fear of the draft and how unpopular it was in the years after Vietnam, I don't think the Abrams Doctrine's effects make sense. if you have a system where you have the active duty and then the reserves and the guard, and then in the event of a real emergency, you have a draft, that system seems more just to people who are opponents of the draft. So I think that was really the political impact of the Abrams Doctrine. Also, while she thinks that it is a deterrent to being able to take action, I would say, if anything, it makes action more plausible. And especially in the years after Vietnam, it makes action more plausible because, again, the main concern people had was the draft. And if you have the Abrams Doctrine in place, this makes a draft unlikely unless things really go to shit. So let's now get into some of the virtues of the work. One virtue is that while she does overestimate Reagan's role in the rise of perpetual war, I think that she is right to give him a prominent position in that process, and especially in the process of claiming the executive's ability to do whatever it wants. Reagan was a guy who consistently tried to push the boundaries and go around Congress. Reagan was also one of the main promoters, or at least his Attorney General Meese and some of his other advisors, such as Dick Cheney, were big proponents of the idea of the unitary executive. Maddow goes through in detail Reagan's foreign policy adventures and how he consistently butted heads with Congress and over time established the norm of the president being able to do what he wanted. She talks about Grenada and Nicaragua and other 80s interventions that Reagan made. So I recommend the book just for that reason alone in many ways. If you're unfamiliar with the impact that Reagan had on American foreign policy, this book actually does a pretty decent job of explaining it. And of course, as someone who is an adamant foe of Ronald Reagan, Rachel Maddow also goes through Iran-Contra in great detail. Another virtue of the work is that it outlines how the foreign policy establishment came to be and precisely why it is almost entirely dominated by right-wingers. Suffice it to say that since the people who work in these think tanks recommend whether or not the military should spend more money, the military and defense contractors are always going to look at studies which call for the spending of more money and say that those people are correct and realistic, and anybody opposing them is naive, foolish, and possibly a traitor. It's as predictable as the sun rising in the east every morning. Another virtue of the work is that while it's pretty well known that Reagan did escalate the Cold War as president and get it heated back up again in terms of an arms race, Maddow goes through this in a fair amount of detail and goes through some of Reagan's red baiting and the impact this had on the military and our sort of national mindset about defense spending. So if you want to learn the real impact of Reagan's escalation of the Cold War, beyond putting some pressure on Gorbachev, then this book, again, is pretty important. In essence, what she's arguing is that by really ramping up the military and ramping up spending and empowering fearmongers, we went a long way toward a perpetual state of war, and that had Reagan chosen not to escalate things with the Soviet Union, then perhaps we would not be where we're at now. Although I'm of the opinion the USSR was already doomed by 1980, it may have taken a couple years longer, but I think the end result was already pretty much in place by the time that Reagan started red baiting. One other virtue of the work is that she talks about how Reagan liked to paint his opponents as communist. So this could be Democrats to his left, this could be protesters who were anti-war, people who wanted to investigate Iran-Contra, things like that. He would just insinuate or outright say that they were communist. In the world around us today, we see that Trump's RNC in 2020 was basically just a parody of that, talking about socialists around every bend. So I guess there's nothing new under the sun. One flaw, though, is that Maddow doesn't observe how old hat this was by the 1980s. Reagan did not invent red baiting, not by a long shot. J. Edgar Hoover in the 1930s was convinced that a communist coup was imminent, and he was reluctant to investigate American fascists, and he kept pressing FDR to look more into communist. FDR did look into communist, but he made sure that Hoover also investigated fascist. It was a hard argument. He had to keep calling Hoover back into his office. No, seriously, please look into fascism. It's kind of a problem. This was also a tactic used against the civil rights movement. There were people who said that the protests in the civil rights era were taking their orders from Moscow, which was trying to sow division in America. Apparently also it was the Russians who brought slaves across the Atlantic. Who would have thought it, right? Another virtue of the work is that it points out one of the innovations of the 1980s was to try to find convenient and frankly beatable enemies. Reagan fought a lot of small little conflicts in Latin America. Grenada was one of the weakest countries on the face of the earth, and Reagan shockingly was able to defeat them. This actually did improve his standing with the country, because people were so used to this sort of defeatist attitude in the wake of Vietnam. So even though the actual execution of Grenada was woefully incompetent, as Maddow details, and actually outright embarrassing in terms of military efficiency in the wake of literally no opposition, we somehow took casualties without really encountering any opposition. And I think we're looking at maybe 100 total casualties, mostly wounded. So I want you to think about that for a second. This was considered a foreign policy success. Anyway, I think that a lot of what she says about Reagan is a much-needed wake-up call for people who like to look back and really glamorize the Reagan years or see him as a moderate or one of the last good Republicans or whatever it might be. I think that it's a much-needed dose of reality. Okay. So, as I mentioned, she has a very good explanation of Iran-Contra. However, we do have to remember that she is a Gen X Democrat, so for her, Ronald Reagan is basically Satan, and Iran-Contra was her generation's equivalent, or at least the people of her political persuasion in her generation, equivalent of Watergate, so there is a tendency to exaggerate its importance. It was a big deal, don't get me wrong, but it is not quite as big of a deal as Maddow implies. She effectively argues that the Abrams Doctrine made the selling of the Gulf War to the public necessary. And much of her evidence for this is simply that Colin Powell, as the chief of the Joint Staff, was very much not a big fan of wars that were not defined, because he thought that the lesson of Vietnam is that you should have a mission that you can accomplish and set out with the tools needed to get the job done, get the hell out. Exactly how well that actually represents Powell's thinking, I'm not sure. I do suspect that Maddow might be romanticizing him a little bit and also liberalizing him a bit. But suffice it to say that even if this is Powell's understanding of the Abrams Doctrine, this is not an understanding shared by everyone. And also, even if Powell does not understand the Abrams Doctrine this way, he probably could have interpreted it in that fashion. So we have to be wary of trying to read too much into Powell's personal views, as I think Maddow might be doing. She also points out that Reagan and Bush argued that public debate over war was dangerous, and that's something which has become, by and large, a duh statement for Republicans. Especially during the W. Bush years, anyone who questioned why we're in Iraq or anything of that nature was called unpatriotic, unsupportive of the troops, treasonous, soft, whatever it might be. And that was not necessarily the case in the past, where there was more open debate on whether or not we should get involved in different countries. Although we don't want to romanticize that too much, there also were pro-war demonstrations during the Vietnam era, so yeah. But still, it has become basically a matter of party doctrine for one party at least, and for a significant chunk of the other, that we don't really question these decisions. I think that's a pretty dangerous thing. One of the virtues of the book is that she actually points to an instance where Congress did its job and stood up to a president and stopped him from committing more troops to a situation which was most likely hopeless. I'm referring to the time when Congress stepped in and demanded that Gerald Ford not deploy more troops in the South Vietnam to prevent its fall. This is a good example of when Congress actually does something to engage in the process of helping to determine foreign policy. However, what Maddow ignores is that Gerald Ford was a president lacking prestige or, frankly, legitimacy. He received 0 votes for the position he was in, and he was handpicked by a guy who was still deeply disgraced in Richard Nixon. Ford's prestige and the prestige of the White House in general was so low that even Republicans felt comfortable taking pot shots at their own president in order to prove that they were not partisan hacks, and that they too were very concerned that the country not get itself too involved in foreign escapades. She also does a pretty good job of making it clear that in the lead up to the Gulf War of 1991, that George H.W. Bush was almost entirely disinterested in any kind of diplomatic solution to the conflict. At every turn, there were potential diplomatic solutions, and he would have none of it. He insisted that it be war. That's something I think people forget and are largely willing to forgive simply because of how the conflict turned out. That being said, the process of how we go to war often does influence the outcome, so it's something that we should probably think much more deeply about. Another virtue of her work is that she points out the pros and cons of a professional army. At this juncture, we kind of take it for granted that we have a professional standing army, and I think that many people kind of forget that at one point this was not really the case. This is very much a post-World War II development. Now, sure, we technically had a standing army before the war, but it was very much an army of a skeleton of an army with professional officers who could then be promoted as the military's ranks fleshed out and the country prepared for war. So there is a pretty substantial difference that took place in 1945. And going back to what I was talking about with the framing of how we got to this perpetual state of war, I think that even 1945 could be a valid starting place, since that's when we really start to have a permanent and functionally large military. Let's see. She also does a good job of explaining exactly how expensive military benefits are and how the payment of benefits, whether we're talking about combat pay or expenses related to keeping military dependents entertained or providing for childcare or what have you, really fall upon the DoD and how that drives up expenses. Going to war, a lot of the cost is simply the extra cost of having to pay different military personnel and their families. So, that really does a good job also of setting up her discussion of how and why the military began to look at privatization, especially under George H.W. Bush and really accelerating to the maximum under Bill Clinton. And then even more under George W. Bush, although she doesn't really talk about that, oddly enough. She does a great job of explaining how and why the military went private, or at least lots of it went private. Effectively, with the budget cuts to the 90s, which the military and the foreign policy establishment predicted, they knew that this would diminish capacity unless they could find a circumvention. The circumvention is that if you contract out different services, you can get around the hard cap on military spending, and it becomes less expensive technically to deploy troops. So, under the rules of log cap, which was established in the 90s, the military is able to contract out many functions and a lot of support functions, and this enables them to do operations without going over their budget technically. Of course, despite the orthodoxy of the 90s that the private sector is always more efficient, that has been the exact opposite experience of what has happened with these military contractors. Often they have extremely low standards, and also they very frequently overrun their cost estimations. One of the flaws with her discussion of privatization is that while she does talk about Bill Clinton and Al Gore and their role in this process, and she does hold them accountable, she very much does try to downplay what they did in certain points. So at one point she's talking at length about the Bosnian conflict, which was the first time that we saw a lot of the contractors in action for the first time. And while she does mention the abuses and how embarrassing and horrible it all was, she rarely mentions the name Bill Clinton in that discussion. So I think that just in the interest of fairness, if she did this for Reagan, Reagan's name was never far from the foibles of the 80s, then she should do the same for Bill Clinton during the 90s. One of the great virtues of the work is that she does do an excellent job of outlining the fraud committed by military contractors and also the horrifying abuses. She also talks about how military contractors are not technically subject to military discipline, and that normally if they are found to be misbehaving, they are simply cashiered and sent home, if they're punished at all. She has a pretty extended and difficult to get through section about the specific abuses of one base camp where a lot of mechanics were working, and where some of them went so far as to purchase Serbian sex slaves. So yes, these were Americans working abroad, sometimes not Americans, you don't have to contract out to Americans. But there were Americans at this base camp who were working on helicopters. Many of them were not first-rate personnel. They were less professional and efficient than military personnel would have been doing the same task, but they were paid more money, and the company got a big bonus from it. And also, these guys were doing things which would have easily gotten any soldier court-martialed. So, I recommend the book just for that section alone. I think it's important to know the history of what we can expect out of military contractors. Given that we have not had an administration which has cared anything about accountability in my lifetime, I don't see how we can continue to employ these military contractors with a clear conscience. We're effectively asking them to do these things when we deploy them. So, effectively, one of the other arguments that she makes is that from the time of George H.W. Bush onward, that is to say, from the time that the Soviet Union collapsed to the present, the job of the president and the defense establishment has been to search for new threats in order to justify war, and more importantly, war spending. For the most part, she tries to pin this on the Republicans primarily, so I have to add the Democrats also. Clearly, neither Bill Clinton nor Barack Obama was a slacker when it came to finding new people to drop bombs on. With the privatization thing, again, she makes sure to talk about how it was pioneered by Bush. However, I think that she underestimates the degree to which it really exploded under Clinton. And also, she does talk about Al Gore's role in setting this up technocratically. But again, because she doesn't want to blame the Democrats too much, I think that she downplays it, if anything. So that is one caution that you should have. one quote here about log cap that I'd like to share with you, and how she tries to tie this in with the larger American tradition. So, quote from page 176 to 177. And so nobody in the Clinton administration ever really apprehended the acute and lasting problems of log cap and the thousands of other small privatization ploys they unleashed. The acute and lasting problem was that they cut that mooring line tying our wars to our politics, the line that tied the decision to go to war to public debate about that decision. The idea of the Abrams Doctrine and Jefferson's citizen soldiers was to make it so we can't war without causing a big civilian hullabaloo. Or hullabaloo, I think that's the right way to say it. Privatization made it all easy and quiet, end quote. So, here, despite what she says earlier, I think that she's trying to let Clinton off the hook a little bit by saying that his privatization efforts in log cap were, or at least led to unintended consequences down the line. I don't think that's true, though. I think it was very much by design. The idea behind the foreign policy establishment is that you make it as easy as possible to wage war without any congressional or public accountability. That was what Bill Clinton and Al Gore were working towards. Their advisors, although they might have D's after their names, were still very much in line with neoconservative thinking. Maddow herself points out earlier that pretty much all of the think tanks which deal with foreign policy are some degree of right-leaning. There was not much real difference on foreign policy between the Clintons and the Bushes. Now, maybe there's some difference around the edges. I've frequently said that the difference is, do we simply drop bombs or do we send in troops as well? That's really what the difference boils down to when it comes to establishment Democrats and establishment Republicans and foreign policy. There's also a little bit of difference in how much we spend, but both agree that we should always spend more money on the military. This has become standard issue foreign policy thinking on both sides of the aisle. There is an interesting section on the decision to intervene in Bosnia, and once again, Colin Powell plays the role of advocate of keeping the peace. And it's kind of a weird section because it's clear that Maddow wants to retain Powell as the hero. He was still the chief of staff at the time. But usually the Democrats will herald the Bosnia intervention as a great success for Bill Clinton. And as someone who is personally an anti-interventionist, Bosnia is always the thing I have to explain away. It's the one U.S. intervention which actually had positive results, whereas most other ones had a lot of unintended negative consequences. So I find it odd that Maddow is kind of trying to make Powell the good guy while he's trying to stop it. And especially when his reason for doing so is effectively that Bosnia doesn't matter because it doesn't have oil. So the way that she approached this part was very odd. And it really makes me want to read other accounts of the decision to go to war in Bosnia. Because if her account's accurate, then it actually makes it way more interesting. Because it's a truly bizarre process by which the Clinton administration decided to get involved in war. One other little point that she makes that I found interesting is that she points out how the U.S. military got involved in the business of training foreign officers and how the U.S. trained the Croatian officer corps prior to their war against Milosevic. So Croatia kind of shocked the world after our intervention in Bosnia because they launched a massively successful campaign against the Serbian army, which up to that point had been seen as the premier army of the former Yugoslavia. But the Croatians emulated American tactics and strategy and really kicked some ass. She also, I think, makes a good point and does correctly assign blame for permanent war on decisions made prior to 9/11 and really contextualizes 9/11 correctly as a catalyst rather than as a primary or sole cause. She states explicitly that by 2001, log cap had normalized perpetual and undeclared wars. So I think that she makes that argument very, very well, and I really wish that she had focused her narrative more on the bevy of things needed to enable the president to do what he wants, and then made her primary focus on log cap, rather than making the Abrams Doctrine so central to her argument, because I think log cap is a much firmer piece of evidence. Whereas arguably with the Abrams Doctrine, she doesn't even interpret it correctly. So that is kind of a problem. There's a discussion of Bush, but she begins that one by talking about the long-term consequences of Bush's endless wars with a detailed and frankly damning portrait of Obama's 2011 activities. So in 2011, Obama's CIA was running wild. He went into Pakistan without the permission of our ally Pakistan to kill bin Laden, and he was doing drone strikes at a record rate. And she wants to know, how did we get to this point? I really think, in retrospect, she should have made this the hook to the entire book, but she didn't. Maybe if there's a future edition of this, if she revisits this book without putting her new set of beliefs in it, then that's how she'll reorganize it. I don't know. But at any rate, I think this passage would have been an excellent hook for the entire book. She also goes through a lot of examples of CIA coups from the 1950s forward. And as I will show in my Spirit of Thersites video, all of that is ironic given how easily she accepts anything the CIA says now. In 2012, when she wrote this book, and for the period surrounding that, she was quite critical of the CIA's competence and commitment to doing a positive service to the world. So it's really an interesting transformation with Maddow. One of the things that she observes is that Bush's Joint Strategic Operations Command effectively operates free from our Special Operations Command. I'm not very good with acronyms. I prefer actual words. Anyway, JSOC operates anywhere with no real oversight, and she points to that as one of the real cruxes of the problem. And I think that she's right. That is a major issue. JSOC effectively reports directly to the president, and we don't even know how they spend their money, so there's not really much telling what they're up to at any given time. We only really find out what happens when, say, the soldiers that were deployed in Africa got killed. And then the news was, well, there were some American service members who were horribly killed in combat, where the headline should have been, why in the hell were there American soldiers in that particular country? When was that decision made? So, she also likes to really invoke the Jeffersonian spirit. Famously, Thomas Jefferson, when he set up the military academy at West Point, made it a school primarily focused on engineering because he did not want to militarize American society. She says from page 214, quote, "With the world's greatest privately augmented standing army in place, we are, as Jefferson feared, constantly scanning the horizon for a speck of war." I actually think that she does a pretty good job of invoking Jeffersonian principles here. Thomas Jefferson was very much opposed to having a standing army, partly because of the fear of us getting into wars too often. Although I think that she did not mention Jefferson's fear of a military coup or the balance of power falling too much to sort of a military aristocracy. So I think that's a part of Jefferson's thinking that she didn't talk about. Although, to be fair, of course, this was not a book about Jefferson's political thought, and we can only expect so much history from a work which is fundamentally political. She also speaks about Dave Petraeus as CIA director calling for keeping up full-spectrum capabilities that American soldiers have achieved since 9/11. By full spectrum capabilities, he effectively means being able to do police work and other things that occupation forces do, which are rarely performed by combat soldiers. So, effectively, this quote reveals, and Maddow employs it as such, that by engaging in these endless wars as we have, the fundamental job of the military in many ways has been stealthily redesigned. The Army is no longer engineered to win massive field battles the way that it was up until the end of the 80s, but rather to serve as an occupying force. And that is quite a transformation, one which really had no public debate. And yeah, that's a major change from what the Army has traditionally been. One flaw is that while pointing all of this out, Maddow doesn't quite connect the dots into how this perpetual deployment and, quote, full spectrum capabilities that Petraeus is promoting has undermined the military's ability to wage war in the traditional sense. The Army is less able to fight and win a mass-scale engagement against, say, China than it would have been prior to the Iraq and Afghan wars. And the reason is that these wars of occupation are very much small-scale, whereas any kind of war against a major power would be on a larger scale and require the kinds of operations that we don't really have the money to even train for at this point because of the expenses related to deployment and the constant wear and tear on equipment caused by deploying it into extreme environments. And one virtue of the work is that she points out that a lot of the fears that fearmongers like to bring up, i.e. about all the rising rivals, really ignore the fact that these supposed rivals have become threats because of their economies and not because of their military capacity. She argues that by spending money so much on all of these military operations, we have in many ways weakened our economy, and our economy has come to depend heavily on military spending. And in many ways, this has made us more fragile. I think that's actually a great point. If you look at the U.S. military going into World War II, we had much less of a military tradition, and frankly, the U.S. military was not all that great going into the war. But we had industrial might, and this gave us a big cushion for error. We had the most actual strength over the long run. Right now, that is not necessarily the case. Our military has a lot of experience, but we don't have as deep of a bench. We also don't have all that much industrial capacity compared with what we had vis-a-vis the rest of the world in the 1940s. So I think that she raises a great point there. In many ways, the people who are saber-rattling and talking about the strength of our troops and all of that are ignoring a larger picture. Chapter 9 I consider to be a bonus to the book. It has very little to do with the general drift of drift, but it is still a fascinating chapter, and it plays to one of Maddow's sort of pet interest. That is nuclear warfare and nuclear disarmament. The whole chapter talks about the neglect of our nuclear stockpile, how various weapons are decaying and not being properly maintained, how the Air Force has not really emphasized this branch of service because it's unglamorous. You have to live in South Dakota or wherever and work at a silo in the middle of nowhere. And she also outlines how careless the U.S. has been in the past with their nuclear stockpile. It's well known that other nuclear powers have had issues keeping their bombs where they're supposed to be, but we also have been very culpable in that as well. And I think that this is a terrifying chapter. It shows the incompetence and neglect of the military when it comes to dealing with nuclear weapons. It should be sort of a call to action. So again, I consider it a bonus, though, because it's not quite directly tied in with the rest of the book. Nonetheless, it is worth reading. And were it to be published as a separate essay, it would also be worth reading. Another thing that she brings up, although probably a little out of place, is in her conclusion she talks about one of the norms which has helped to bring about perpetual war is the Bush administration's decision to make it abnormal to show caskets or funerals for service members, even when service members request it. During the Vietnam era, people were aware of the body count due to news coverage. Now they're not. Those kind of things are hushed up, and the Republicans who defend it mostly talk about how it is inappropriate to show these things. It's disrespectful to the families. This argument was also made early in the Trump years when that event in Africa went down and the helmet footage of one of the soldiers who died in action was shown, and you could see him dying and the blood rolling over his helmet, or his camera, excuse me. And a lot of people were outraged that someone would show an American service member die in action. However, I made a video that was not well received where I said, look, people need to know the cost of war. And I stand by that. People need to know that people are getting killed abroad, that our countrymen are dying in foreign lands. And we need to talk about why the hell they're there in the first place, too. Again, this sort of norm of we can't show dead soldiers, period, is something which is basically brand new, or at least pretty new, and then being defended as if it's some tradition going back to Washington's army at Valley Forge, when it just simply is not. Maddow really helps to bring home her central thesis that there's this great divide between the military and civilians, with a stat that 84% of war on terror veterans say that the public does not understand the problems that they and their families face. Her sort of closing thought, which I think is pretty important, quote, with no check on its growth and no rival for its political influence, the superfunded, super-empowered national security state has become a leviathan. So, yeah, I think that despite some of the things Rachel Maddow has done in the recent past, her book is absolutely worth a read. It is not the be-all and end-all of how we got to where we are in terms of the state of perpetual war, but I think that it is a good place to start. It's relatively short at about 250 pages. It's accessible, fairly well written. The research is decent, if not great. That being said, it's way better research than almost any other book written by a pundit. Most pundits just kind of lay out their opinions and maybe quote a few stats here or there. But Maddow, I think operates at maybe about the level of popular history with this work. So even if you're just reading this book as a work of history, I think it actually pretty much works. So this one gets my seal of approval, although I do have to imagine that there are better books on this subject out there, and I'm in the process of looking for those now. If you know of any books which deal with this topic, please let me know in the comments below. I do have one with a title that's something like How the Military Became Everything and How Everything Became the Military, and I plan on looking at that book soon. So I might be back within the next couple of months to discuss that. So remember to check out my Spirit of Thersites channel, where I will do a follow-up to this video and look more in depth at the politics of Maddow's drift and also her personal drift away from sanity and anything resembling principles. Until then, I'm Thersites the Historian. Peace out.